Your support keeps these stories alive. Please like, share, and subscribe. I sat on the edge of the hospital bed, still holding Margaret's hand, my mother-in-law's, as it grew cold. The only sound left in the room was the long, monotonous beeping of the heart monitor. No one else was there, not my husband, Daniel, not his sister, Lauren. No hurried footsteps, no late phone calls, no half-hearted apologies. The nurse had just walked out after confirming the time of death. 3:15 p.m. Tuesday. Everything had happened in a silence so brutal it felt intentional. I leaned down and pressed my hand to her forehead one last time. Startled by the absolute stillness of the room. On the other side of the wall, I could hear families comforting each other. Children giggling, a doctor delivering good news. But in here, it was just me and a woman who had left this world completely alone. Miss Anna, the nurse's voice broke the quiet from behind me. She approached, holding an envelope folded neatly in her hands. Mrs. Margaret left this for you. She said it was to be delivered only after she passed. My heart clenched as I looked at the envelope. My name, Anna Larson, was written in a slanted but firm hand. A handwriting I never thought would be tied to trust. I was never close with Margaret. She was the kind of New England traditionalist who was always polite enough to avoid criticism, but cold enough to keep me feeling like an outsider. So when I took the letter, part of me was afraid. The rest was shaken by curiosity. I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a small, old key taped to it. Below the key, a single sentence had been written in slow but steady strokes. They never loved me. Now they'll understand what it feels like to be forgotten. I stared at the words as if they might vanish any second. My throat felt dry. My hands trembled slightly. The nurse was still standing there. Would you like me to call someone? She asked gently. I shook my head, folded the letter, and slipped it into my purse. No, thank you. I wasn't sure what tone my voice had taken. Robotic, maybe, or choked. I only knew I didn't want to hear another condolence. Especially not from the only person kind enough to still be standing here with me. I walked out to the parking lot. The California sky was blue and sharp in the autumn air. The sun still shone, but it no longer felt warm. People came and went, chatting, smiling, hugging as they left the hospital. I, in contrast, moved as if I'd just exited a world that had shut behind me for good. Inside the car, I turned on the AC, but didn't feel it. The paper in my purse felt like it was burning through the fabric. The key, too, heavier than something so small should be. I called Daniel. No answer. I left a message, your mother died. 3:15 p.m. I was there. No more words. I didn't expect a response. After 3 days of staying by the bedside and calling him no fewer than 10 times a day, I understood he wasn't coming. And Lauren hadn't even bothered to send a single text. Margaret had been right. They never loved her. And now they would know what it felt like to be ignored, to be left out. I held the key in my hand. The chill of it spread from my palm to my shoulder. I didn't know what it opened. A house? A forgotten room? A hidden memory? I spent that whole evening sitting in front of Margaret's letter. The kitchen light casting a strange glow on the slanted handwriting. Almost as if she were still somewhere nearby watching. Below the final line was an address, Pinewood, 16, Old Oak Lane. I had never heard Daniel or Lauren mention it. When I searched the map, I found it was just over an hour outside the city, deep in the northern woods near the Shasta County border. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, I grabbed the key, put on a heavy coat, and got in the car. I didn't tell Daniel. Honestly, I no longer felt the need to explain anything to him. The road to Pinewood wound through the forest. Each curve making me feel like I was slipping back in time. No clear signs, no phone signal, just towering trees and a gray sky hanging low above me. The house appeared around a bend, almost swallowed by the woods. The wood-shingled roof had faded. The paint was peeling in large patches. But what stopped me was the wooden sign hanging on the rusted gate. Maison Pine written in delicate French script. Unmistakably Margaret's handwriting. I parked, stepped out, and walked closer. The gate creaked as I pushed it open, moss thick on the ground as if no one had walked there in years. The key fit perfectly. As the door opened, a cold draft rushed out, carrying the scent of old paper, rotting wood, and lavender. Margaret's signature fragrance. My chest tightened. Inside, the house was dusty, but not disordered. Everything was neatly arranged. The armchair near the fireplace, the grandfather clock ticking steadily. On the dining table sat a vase of dried flowers. Beside a faded photograph, a young woman with curled red hair laughing beside a tall man with messy dark hair. I knew instantly it was Margaret in her youth. I wandered through the house. Each room felt like a vault of memories. A piano draped in lace, drawers full of sheet music, a small bedroom with a navy bedspread, shelves packed with books. But it was the last room at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar, that drew me in. On an old wooden desk inside was a cream envelope. On it was written, "To my attorney, Elizabeth Harper, to be opened only in the presence of Anna Larson." I had never heard Margaret mention Elizabeth Harper, and I had no idea why she'd want me present when this envelope was opened. I picked it up, fingertips brushing the dried wax seal. It felt like I was holding a crucial piece of a puzzle I didn't even know I was part of. I didn't open it. Margaret had been clear. Back in the living room, I sat in the armchair, eyes resting on the painting above the fireplace. A summer meadow in Pinewood, vivid and bright. In it, a little girl with brown hair stood beside a stream, gazing toward a small house in the distance. I looked closer. The bottom corner of the painting bore a signature, MS 1987. Margaret Sullivan when she was still a woman with dreams and hopes. So why did she abandon this place? And why did she keep it all a secret not even her husband or children knew? That night I stayed in the cottage. Amid the sound of wind rustling through the shingles and insects humming, I dreamed of Margaret sitting in this very room writing something in a notebook. She turned to me and said, her voice like the wind, "Stay long enough and you'll understand." I woke before dawn, moonlight slanting through the sheer curtain. The letter still sat beside the bed, untouched, but I knew it would unlock a different truth. I returned to the city the next morning, carrying the sealed letter addressed to attorney Elizabeth Harper. Her office was in a modest but dignified 3-story red brick building in downtown Sacramento. When I entered, a young receptionist took the envelope and disappeared inside. Less than 5 minutes later, a heavy wooden door opened. A woman in her 60s with neatly cropped silver hair gestured for me to come in. "Miss Larson, I'm Elizabeth Harper. Please have a seat." Margaret prepared thoroughly for this day. I sat down in a worn leather chair. Ms. Harper opened the envelope, skimmed the contents, sighed quietly, then pulled out a pre-bound file. Margaret requested that the entire family be present for the reading of her will. "That includes your husband Daniel and his sister Lauren. I sent them formal notices this morning." The reading took place 2 days later on a gloomy Thursday afternoon. Daniel and Lauren arrived 5 minutes late, carrying the exact attitude I'd grown used to, indifferent, self-assured, and faintly contemptuous. "Seriously, what's there to read?" Lauren smirked as she sat down. Besides a mountain of hospital bills, Daniel said nothing, just gave me a weary look. He hadn't asked me about the cottage or mentioned my 2-day absence. As usual, I guessed he was waiting for me to bring it up. And when I didn't, his patience began to crack. Attorney Harper began reading the document with calm clarity, each word echoing in the quiet room. "I, Margaret and Sullivan, of sound mind and judgment, declare this will on the 10th day of March." I remembered that day. Margaret had asked me to drive her to an appointment, one I assumed was for a new prescription. I had waited in the car for almost an hour, so this was where she'd gone. Attorney Harper continued, "To my son, Daniel Sullivan. I leave the pocket watch that belonged to his father, as he once expressed the desire to pass it on to his own child. May he, if he becomes a father, learn to appreciate the presence of one." Daniel raised an eyebrow. I heard Lauren scoff. To my daughter, Lauren Mitchell, I leave my family recipe book, the one she always mocked as outdated. May she in her later years come to understand the value of nurturing someone through a meal instead of cutting words. Lauren snapped, ridiculous. Ms. Harper looked up, her eyes meeting mine. And to my daughter-in-law, Anna Larson, I leave the remainder of my estate, including the real property at 16 Old Oak Lane, all bank accounts, investment portfolios, life insurance policies, and all other personal assets. The room sank into stifling silence. Daniel turned to me, his eyes tight with a fury he hadn't yet unleashed. Lauren slammed her hand on the table. What? She gets everything? All of it? I'm not finished, Ms. Harper said, her voice still calm. The total estimated value of the estate is around $700,000. This includes the historic property at Pinewood valued at $310,000, investments of approximately $270,000, and a life insurance policy worth $120,000. Lauren stood abruptly, finger pointed at me. This is fake. Margaret must have been brainwashed. My mother would never leave everything to some outsider like her. Daniel remained standing, shoulders tense. Did you make her do this? He asked. You were with her at the end. What did you say to her? I didn't say anything, I replied, never breaking his gaze. I was simply there. You weren't. Ms. Harper pulled out a psychological evaluation and a USB drive from the folder. Margaret saw an independent psychiatrist a week before signing the will. This document confirms her full mental capacity. She also left a video explaining each decision. If either of you chooses to sue, the court will review everything. Lauren stammered. Daniel lowered his head, hands clenched on his knees. The meeting ended under a heavy silence. I left first, moving with a calmness I didn't know I had. Behind me, Lauren's voice rang out, You won't keep it, I swear. We'll sue. I didn't look back. The more someone clutches and claws, the more they reveal what they're missing inside. 3 weeks after the reading, a yellow envelope arrived at my house, postmarked from Lauren's law firm. Inside was a copy of the lawsuit, bold headline, Petition to invalidate will due to undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. I wasn't surprised. The only thing I felt was an odd calm, as if I'd expected this all along. And something inside me was whispering, let them try. I called Ms. Elizabeth Harper the next morning. I've been waiting for this call, she said simply. Head to the office. We've got a lot to bring to light. At her office, I was introduced to a new figure, Attorney Robert Evans, a specialist in estate dispute litigation. His face was stern, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent. He placed a small USB on the table and slid a thick stack of documents toward me. We'd been working with Margaret for over 4 months before her passing. Not only did she undergo a psychiatric evaluation by Dr. Thomas Freeman, a federally certified mental health expert. She also voluntarily recorded a series of video journals detailing Daniel and Lauren's behavior during the last 2 years of her life. I sat frozen as I took it all in. Would you like to watch it first? Robert asked. I nodded. He plugged the USB into a mini projector. The image appeared, a sunlit room in the nursing home. Margaret sat upright, her silver hair neatly tied back. Her voice came through clearly without hesitation. January 12th. Daniel called me for the first time in 3 months. He asked if I could wire $2,000 to fix the air conditioner. I said no. He hung up without saying goodbye, then blocked my number for 3 days. The screen cut to another video. Lauren stopped by on Saturday. Stayed exactly 10 minutes, brought a cake, and left a note, Don't call me again, Mom. I'm busy. She didn't ask how I was feeling, didn't look at me once on her way out. I couldn't hold back tears as the screen faded to black. On the day of the hearing, it drizzled lightly. Outside the Sacramento County Courthouse stood a few local reporters. One of whom had once interviewed Margaret when she joined an elder rights advocacy campaign 3 years ago. Lauren sat at the plaintiff's table, heavily made up, but visibly tense. Beside her was Daniel, sharp suit on, but eyes dark and sunken. Their attorney, a young man, kept flipping through papers like he was desperate to find a loophole. I sat across from them with Elizabeth and Robert. On our table were all the documents, psychological evaluations, video files, handwritten letters, and reports from nurses at the care facility where Margaret had lived. The hearing lasted nearly 2 hours. The plaintiff's attorney tried to argue that Margaret had been under the influence of medication, that she was confused and easily manipulated. But every claim was dismantled by clear documentation. Margaret's articulate voice in the videos and a report from Dr. Freeman stating, "The patient is fully lucid with complete cognitive capacity and clarity in her personal decisions." When Elizabeth spoke, her voice was low but firm. "If there's any lack of clarity here, it's in the selective absence of both children during Margaret's final years. The court can see that plainly." In the end, the judge ruled to dismiss the claim and ordered Lauren Mitchell to pay all court costs, including our legal fees. Lauren was stunned. Daniel slammed his hand against the back of the chair. I simply sat still, quietly placing the documents into my bag. But the battle wasn't over. 2 weeks later, I heard Lauren had been fired from her role as a communications assistant at Congressman Walker's local office. The media had leaked footage from the courtroom, specifically the part where Elizabeth emphasized how she had abandoned her own mother. As for Daniel, once a prominent real estate broker, his license had been temporarily revoked after investigators uncovered improper borrowing from clients' funds exposed during the will dispute's financial audit. Both of them went silent on social media. No more posts, no more vacation photos, no more perfect family. Margaret hadn't died in vain. She didn't leave behind a fortune for people to fight over. She left behind a message, clear and undeniable: those who sow neglect will reap oblivion. Daniel showed up at my house 3 days after the judge dismissed Lauren's case. No call, no text. He stood at my front door as if he hadn't vanished on the day his mother died. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, eyes sunken, but still carrying that familiar glint of calculation. I didn't open the door all the way. I leaned against the frame. "What do you want?" "We need to talk, Anna, about everything, about us." I paused for a few seconds, then stepped back and let him in. Not because of any lingering feelings, but because I wanted to see how far he'd take the act this time. He sat on the sofa, the one where Margaret used to read when she was well. His eyes scanned the room like he was appraising the value of every item. I sat across from him, arms folded. "You know," he began, "things have been awful lately." Lauren went too far. "But I always believed you didn't mean any harm. It's just Mom made those decisions, and you got caught in the middle." I said nothing. "I miss us, Anna. I miss the way you used to play jazz on Sunday mornings. The way you made tea for Mom even when she never thanked you. Maybe we could start over. You keep the house. Keep everything if you want. I just need you." He pulled out an envelope, not flowers, not a ring, a handwritten letter. Maybe his last attempt at appearing sincere. I didn't take it. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a stamped stack of papers, divorce papers already signed. His expression stiffened. "What is this?" "I signed them 3 weeks ago," I said clearly, each word deliberate. "I was just waiting to see if you'd have the guts to be honest even once." "You didn't. You came here because you know I have everything." His face hardened. "Anna, don't be stupid. You think living in that old cottage is happiness? Do you know what I've been through these past few weeks? My reputation's gone. My career's suspended. I just need a chance." I stood, placed the divorce papers on the table. "You don't need me. You need money." I opened the door. "That way, Daniel." He didn't leave right away, but after a few seconds of silence, he picked up the envelope and walked out. Never looked back. That night, I lay in the small bed inside the cottage. Moonlight washed across the room, quiet and soft. I pulled Margaret's final letter from the nightstand drawer. The line I'd read dozens of times, "Do not forgive. Let them beg and then walk away." I tucked the letter into my wallet. The next morning, the first message came from Lauren. "Anna, please just hear me out once. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm honestly desperate." A few minutes later came the second message: "My account is overdrawn. My landlord's threatening to evict me. The attorney won't return my calls, please. If not for me, then for Mom." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I took a photo of Margaret's letter and sent it with a short reply: "If she said not to." No explanation. I blocked Lauren right after. Both of them went silent on social media. No more posts, no more vacation photos, no more perfect family. Margaret hadn't died in vain. She didn't leave behind a fortune for people to fight over. She left behind a message, clear and undeniable: those who sow neglect will reap oblivion. Daniel showed up at my house 3 days after the judge dismissed Lauren's case. No call, no text. He stood at my front door as if he hadn't vanished on the day his mother died. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, eyes sunken, but still carrying that familiar glint of calculation. I didn't open the door all the way. I leaned against the frame. "What do you want?" "We need to talk, Anna, about everything, about us." I paused for a few seconds, then stepped back and let him in. Not because of any lingering feelings, but because I wanted to see how far he'd take the act this time. He sat on the sofa, the one where Margaret used to read when she was well. His eyes scanned the room like he was appraising the value of every item. I sat across from him, arms folded. "You know," he began, "things have been awful lately. Lauren went too far. But I always believed you didn't mean any harm. It's just Mom made those decisions, and you got caught in the middle." I said nothing. "I miss us, Anna. I miss the way you used to play jazz on Sunday mornings. The way you made tea for Mom even when she never thanked you. Maybe we could start over. You keep the house. Keep everything if you want. I just need you." He pulled out an envelope, not flowers, not a ring, a handwritten letter. Maybe his last attempt at appearing sincere. I didn't take it. Instead, I reached into my jacket and pulled out a stamped stack of papers, divorce papers already signed. His expression stiffened. "What is this?" "I signed them 3 weeks ago," I said clearly, each word deliberate. "I was just waiting to see if you'd have the guts to be honest even once." "You didn't. You came here because you know I have everything." His face hardened. "Anna, don't be stupid. You think living in that old cottage is happiness? Do you know what I've been through these past few weeks? My reputation's gone. My career suspended. I just need a chance." I stood, placed the divorce papers on the table. "You don't need me. You need money." I opened the door. "That way, Daniel." He didn't leave right away, but after a few seconds of silence, he picked up the envelope and walked out. Never looked back. That night, I lay in the small bed inside the cottage. Moonlight washed across the room, quiet and soft. I pulled Margaret's final letter from the nightstand drawer. The line I'd read dozens of times: "Do not forgive. Let them beg and then walk away." I tucked the letter into my wallet. The next morning, the first message came from Lauren. "Anna, please just hear me out once. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm honestly desperate." A few minutes later came the second message: "My account is overdrawn. My landlord's threatening to evict me. The attorney won't return my calls, please. If not for me, then for Mom." I stared at the screen for a long time. Then I took a photo of Margaret's letter and sent it with a short reply: "If she said not to." No explanation. I blocked Lauren right after. That afternoon, I stopped by Haven House, the new name Elizabeth, and I gave the cottage after we began transforming it into a community center. The windows had been replaced, the staircase repainted in a soft olive green. I watched as neighbors helped each other shelf books, fold tablecloths, and prepared for the first meal we'd served to elderly residents in the area. An older woman sat on the porch, her eyes sparkling as she recalled memories of Margaret from church. She used to bake apple pies so good the kids would line up just for a bite. She laughed, holding my hand. "You're just like her, but stronger." I wasn't sure I was as strong as people said. All I knew was this: I chose to stay where others had turned away. And because of that, I found myself. That evening, back in Margaret's small bedroom, I lit a candle by the window. The breeze came in like a soft touch across my cheek. I breathed slowly, as if my body was finally allowed to relax after a long battle. I named the house Pine Haven. Once hidden in an old oak forest, now carrying a new meaning, a safe space for souls the world once forgot. The renovations began right after the court ruling. I used the investment Margaret left to hire workers to fix the roof, replace the plumbing, and restore each weathered oak door. The old windows were swapped out for clear glass, but I kept the original wooden frames to preserve a piece of her in every corner. Elizabeth Harper helped me connect with local nonprofits. Within just 2 months, we launched our first program, Sunday Lunch for elderly individuals living alone. No payment, no sign-ups. They only needed to show up and be welcomed with a smile, a warm seat, and a plate of freshly baked lasagna. An 83-year-old man named Henry, a retired librarian, told me during our first event, "I live at the end of 9th Street. Since my wife passed, I haven't had anyone to talk to. This is the first time I've eaten lunch with others in 4 months." His voice cracked when he mentioned her name. I served him another piece of garlic bread and simply said, "You're welcome here every week. The table by the window is yours." From that point on, Pine Haven was no longer just a house. It became a refuge for broken memories, for those left behind by their own families, for hearts still aching to see someone smile as they crossed the doorway. We added Wednesday reading hours specifically for seniors with impaired vision. A group of university students volunteered to read aloud novels, old love letters, and even Emily Dickinson poems that Margaret had hand-copied in her leather notebook. I dedicated a full shelf in the reading room to Margaret's journals and handwritten letters, now carefully framed. Visitors were surprised by the sharp wit, honesty, and quiet humor in her words. Margaret, once seen as a cold, distant woman, was now becoming a confidant for dozens of women her age. They left handwritten notes for Miss Margaret in a small wooden box by her photo, some tucked in pressed flowers, others embroidered handkerchiefs. One rainy afternoon, Clara Thompson, an old church friend, held my hand after tea and said, "Anna, if Margaret could see this place, I bet she'd purse her lips and say, 'This is all a bit much.' But I know she'd be crying inside." On the 6-month anniversary of Pine Haven's opening, we held a small ceremony. No media, no flashy banners, just members of the community, people who lived as quietly as Margaret once did, now finding each other under a shared roof. I hung a large framed painting in the activity room, drawn by Elizabeth's granddaughter, depicting a young Margaret standing beside the old cottage holding a basket of lavender. Below it, carved into wood, was a single line, "Not everyone who leaves quietly disappears." That night after cleanup, I sat alone in the tiny kitchen where a faint burn mark still lined the oven from the time Margaret overbaked an apricot tart. I placed a small frame on the table, a photo of us taken last spring, one of the rare moments she let me hug her for the camera. I whispered, "See, you're not forgotten. And neither is anyone else." Outside the window, the string lights on the porch reflected softly in the glass like a gentle halo wrapping the house in warmth. 1 year after Margaret passed, I received an invitation from the California Community Care Coalition asking me to speak at their annual conference on elder abandonment. At first, I hesitated. I never saw myself as someone who belonged on a stage. But then I remembered Margaret's eyes, her journal entries, the faint breeze that always moved through the cottage hallways whenever I opened the community library. I said yes. The conference took place in a spacious hall in San Jose. Soft lights, calm acoustics, dozens of faces from clinics, care homes, and nonprofits across the state. When I stepped onto the stage, the microphone was cold in my hand. For a moment, I thought Margaret would hate all this noise. But I also believed if she saw me standing there, she'd be proud. My name is Anna Larson, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. And I'm here today not as a sociologist or a nonprofit director. I'm here as someone who quietly witnessed a woman leave this world alone simply because her children were too busy to turn back. I told Margaret's story not with tears but with truth. That she once cooked for the church. That she handwrote holiday cards to every neighbor at Christmas. That she wrapped birthday presents for people who couldn't even remember hers. And then during the last 3 years of her life, she was called a burden by her own children. I wasn't just speaking about her. I was speaking about a system that forgets loneliness is an illness. I was speaking about Pine Haven, a place where no one is judged for being too old to start over. I was speaking about the empty chair where Henry sits every Sunday afternoon, and the first time he cried simply because someone remembered his name. When I finished, the room stayed silent for a few seconds. Then the applause began. A week later, I received a call from an editor at Willow Press, someone who had watched the speech on video and asked if I would write a book. "Your story isn't just a story," she said. "It's proof that kindness can begin again with an old house and a heart that didn't give up." I wrote nonstop for 3 months. The book was titled The House on Pinewood Hill. Not just a memory of Margaret, but a map for anyone who's ever felt left behind. On launch day, I hosted the event right at Pine Haven. No balloons, no banners, just a wooden tea table, apple pie made from Margaret's recipe, and the people who once told me they didn't think they had anywhere left to return to. Daniel moved to Arizona 3 months after our divorce was finalized. He remarried a 25-year-old receptionist from his old real estate firm. I heard about it through Elizabeth. As for Lauren, I heard she now works the night shift at a roadside diner near Redding. Once Clara dropped by on a trip back home and told me Lauren no longer carried that sharp look she used to. "She doesn't meet anyone's eyes," Clara said. "It's like she's living in a shadow of her own making." I never replied to their final messages. Not out of hatred, but because Margaret taught me something: forgiveness doesn't mean letting people back into your life. I chose to walk forward without looking back. That autumn, I spent 2 days hiking to the top of the hill behind Pine Haven. The one Margaret wrote about in her journal, where she had dreamed of planting lavender, but no longer had the strength to climb. I brought seeds, a small shovel, and patience. I planted the first 5 bushes at sunset, my hands covered in soil, my heart strangely calm. I didn't plant them for Margaret. I planted them for everyone who was ever forgotten. As I rested under the oak trees, my phone buzzed. It was an invitation from a national organization. They wanted me to be an ambassador for their No One Left Behind campaign. I smiled and looked down at the little cottage nestled at the base of the hill, once buried in isolation, now glowing in the golden evening light. The 1-year anniversary of Pine Haven was also the day I chose to host a memorial for Margaret Sullivan, the woman who laid the first stone for everything that exists here now through one final quiet but powerful act. Leaving her legacy to the one person who chose to listen. The sky that day was clear, the autumn sun spreading gently across the lawn behind the cottage where we'd built a small oakwood stage. More people came than I'd expected. Some had lived beside Margaret at the care home. Others only knew her through the book, and some had sat silently during that courtroom hearing, now standing among the crowd, eyes holding something close to regret. The ceremony opened with a jazz piece, Autumn Leaves, the song Margaret listened to every Sunday morning, according to her nurse. No one spoke during the song, just the wind through the oaks, and the rustle of dried lavender swaying in baskets like sound waves. I stepped up to the microphone, holding a single sprig of purple lavender. "I used to think Margaret was cold," I said, my voice steady. "A mother who didn't hug her kids, a quiet, distant old woman. But I was wrong. She wasn't emotionless. She was used to being invisible. And maybe in those final years, Margaret realized if she didn't rewrite her story, no one else ever would." I raised my hand, and the white cloth hanging from the side wall of the cottage was pulled down. The crowd fell silent. On the rough stone wall was a massive mural, Margaret as a young woman sitting on the porch holding an open book, her hair caught in the breeze, eyes looking toward the horizon. And beside her, the curly-haired dog she had written about in her 1996 journal. Below the painting, in delicate calligraphy, were the words, "Not everyone abandoned stays silent. Some rewrite the story from the pieces." Clara moved to my side, her eyes red. She finally got to be seen, didn't she? I offered a quiet look of agreement. But the biggest change didn't come from the mural. It came from the people who found one another because of Margaret. Henry, the elderly man who once ate alone for 4 months, now led the Friday book club at Pine Haven. He stood and spoke, his voice trembling gently. "Thank you, Margaret, for leaving a door open so survivors like me had somewhere to walk in without having to knock." And in that moment, standing among them, I understood something more clearly than ever before. Margaret didn't leave behind wealth. She left behind seeds. And it was her family's cruelty, their abandonment, their silence that gave those seeds the strength to grow. In me, in everyone who had once been forgotten. That night, after the guests had left and the string lights dimmed across the porch, I stayed alone in the little library. I opened the last drawer, the one where I kept Margaret's final journal, the pages she had been writing before she was hospitalized. One was marked with a pressed flower. If someone had really listened, maybe I wouldn't have had to scream through silence. But if I had to choose, I'd want my story told. Not in my voice, but in the voice of someone who understood everything I never said. I closed the journal. My eyes stayed dry, but my heart was heavy and full. Daniel never called again. Clara told me he opened a small office in Tucson and now lives quietly with his new wife. No one there seems to know his past or Lauren's. I once saw Lauren in a short news segment about job support programs for women affected by the pandemic. Not as a guest, she was in the line holding an application form. I didn't call, didn't write. I simply closed the laptop. A year had passed like the final page in a worn book. But I didn't close it. I placed it on the highest shelf in the library beside the book I'd written about Margaret, next to the frame of dried lavender crafted by the elderly women in our art group. And I left a small handwritten note in purple ink: "You didn't disappear. You're still living inside every one of us." And with that, I walked out of the room, gently closed the door behind me. Not to end something, but to carry it forward into a new story, with a new generation. Still echoing the voice of the woman who was once forgotten. Margaret Sullivan, the one who taught me, legacy isn't what we leave behind, it's what we plant. Anna's story is not just a journey through betrayal and loneliness. It's proof that kindness, though often dismissed, can be reborn and multiplied. In a world that's increasingly hurried and indifferent, Pine Haven has become a symbol of listening, empathy, and healing. Sometimes the most valuable legacy isn't wealth. It's the courage to rewrite the story of someone who was once invisible and turn it into the beginning of many others. What are your thoughts on Anna's journey and the legacy Margaret left behind? Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to follow the channel for more heartfelt, meaningful stories about family and redemption.